Here's another guy from Montreal. Now, it's not a plot, I promise you. We didn't like get together in advance and list all the people from Montreal. That's just how it's turned out. His name is Hershey Felder, but you could say that in some ways he's the reincarnation of George Gershwin. So deep is his commitment to, and so brilliant is his playing of the Gershwin story and the Gershwin music. Hershey's a concert artist, he's an actor, he's a composer, he's a director, and latterly I know he's taken on the mantle of a producer. He's also known to Canadians as the life partner and the creative partner of the Honorable Kim Campbell. And together they've written an opera called Noah's Ark. Kim gave us a rousing speech at the last IdeaCity, and this year it's Hershey's turn.
So for those of you that are curious what a former prime minister's wife looks like, thank you, Moses, for such a beautiful introduction. In fact, George Gershwin is just one of the things that I do. It began as a trilogy. It was a character that I wanted to study and wanted to bring to life on the stage. So Kim and I decided I need to go on a diet, and I went on a diet and managed to look a little bit like George. A couple of years ago, we did this project. I thought it's going to run 3 weeks. My family, my relatives, and all the Canadians that are in Los Angeles would come. It would be over. 2.5 years later, it's been to Florida. It played 7 months in Los Angeles. It opened on Broadway. And a couple days ago, opened in Cambridge. So I'm now actually in the middle of a run, playing the role of George Gershwin alone in Cambridge. It's a great deal of fun. The themes that exist in George Gershwin alone, and some of the stuff that was interesting to me, seem to run through all these composers that I want to bring to the stage. The others are Chopin and George Sand, which is a love relationship, artists in the 19th century. And of course, the third will be Beethoven. This is a project that will go over 5 years. All eventually will play in New York one after the other, night 1, night 2, night 3, and continue the run that way. The first was George Gershwin alone, and as I began to study him, I began to learn the themes of this man. The themes of this man were that he died way before he could accomplish what he set out to do. He died when he was 38, suddenly, of a brain tumor. When he died, people didn't think much of his serious work. In fact, Porgy and Bess was panned. And one of the things that was curious to me was what it must be like for us 70 years later to think, wow, what a gift he gave us. Yet the last 5 years of his life were essentially, he probably died of a broken heart. I mean, figuratively, of course. But think about that. And that theme began to run throughout my work, and then I began to look at it in terms of Chopin as well. You know, he was very derided when he first came. I mean, they used to call his music clumsy, not good, bad transpositions, all kinds of weird things. It was very odd. And then I started to think about how that affects my life with Kim and so on, and what I've seen on the outside. I was born in Montreal, but I haven't lived in Canada in 12 years. And I did watch Kim's career from the outside. It was fascinating, to say the least. And the more I got to learn about it, the more all these themes started to take place in my head. We'll begin with a little bit of George Gershwin. It's a little funny scene. It's lifted directly from a radio commercial from 1934. For CBS Studios, George was working on Porgy and Bess. And of course, to create this great opera, who was going to pay a little Jewish boy, famous albeit on Broadway, but who was going to pay a Jewish boy from Brooklyn to write the world's first great American black jazz opera in 1934? It wasn't happening, you know. So he actually had to take a job at CBS Studios. And this is a little scene lifted from actually a radio commercial, word for word. Porgy and Bess would take the better part of a year to create. With so much work, and at the time, no other source of income, I had to find a way to support the manner to which I had grown accustomed. So I took a job as a radio show host for CBS Studios. Well, radio was new. Never before could so many people from such faraway places hear one live musical performance and all at the same time. So every Sunday evening, I would head down to the studio where the entire nation could hear the music of George Gershwin floating on airwaves. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George Gershwin, and welcome to Music by Gershwin for Sunday, December 23rd, 1934. I would now like to play for you our signature tune here at CBS Studios of Music by Gershwin, one of Ira's and my favorite own compositions, The Man I Love, with a brief word from our sponsor. Phenomint, America's favorite chewing gum laxative. Specialists in the field of internal medicine have revealed this important fact. A laxative does its work most naturally and effectively when taken in the form of which it can be chewed. Yourself and see what a difference it makes in correcting your daily routine. So then you think about what this guy had to go through. And here, you know, when I was invited to do this IdeaCity, you know, the first thing you think of is, did I have an idea in my head, you know? And I thought about what is a theme that ran through all of this? And here's how I sort of brought the Canadian side to the idea of George Gershwin, Chopin, all this other stuff. And this is something that I've been talking to Kim a lot about, and it's something that really does deeply affect me. I think affects all of us in the end. The notion that here was George Gershwin who devoted his life to Porgy and Bess, to the creation of that kind of opera, 1933, 34, 35, gets sick, 37, has a brain tumor, drops dead. Porgy and Bess is an absolute failure across the boards. Nobody wants to hear it, nobody wants to see it. It closes only after a few months on Broadway. He, Ira, and DuBose Hayward invested all their own money to make it work. They lost everything. Critics said these kind of things. George Gershwin doesn't even know what an opera is. Now, think 70 years later, the guy who wrote "Swonderful, marvelous, you should care for me. There's a somebody I'm longing to see, I hope that he'll turn out to be. Swanee, how I love ya, I got rhythm." I mean, things that have really crept into our collective imagination. Summertime, and the living is easy. Perhaps 150, 200 contemporary artists have covered that tune. Now, when it was written, George was a complete failure. No money. He had to go to Hollywood to pursue a career because nobody was going to have him in New York. Nobody wanted seriousness. What I started to think about is, gee, you know, responsibility. Here's a journalist, a critic, comes, sees a show once, very nice, says, you know what, I didn't like that. Writes, George Gershwin doesn't even know what an opera is. One of the things as a performer that I'm beginning to see, and I've seen it also in Kim's career, here's an example. We were, I don't know, so it had come out that we were boyfriend and girlfriend. I'm 20 years younger, da-da-da. They're writing about it in the newspapers, and it was printed somewhere in Alberta that this story, some, I don't know, Canadian newspaper, and it was printed, Kim Campbell, with her young boyfriend, whatever it is, Kim Campbell, Canada's 25th Prime Minister. This article was reprinted across the country. From that article, Kim Campbell, 25th Prime Minister, and her young boyfriend. The current Prime Minister is the 20th. I started to think about journalism, and I started to think about the pot shots and the responsibility. The more I got into Gershwin's career, the more I thought about how easy it is to just dash something off, how easy it is to say anything about anyone, good, bad, or otherwise. Truthful doesn't matter. My goal is, at some point, to sort of bring to life this notion that when you write about somebody, when you actually serve another person's life, there is another person on the other end who actually has to live that life after whoever it is has written about them. And sometimes that can hurt, and sometimes it can be very destructive. And I've seen it. I've seen it with me. I've seen it with Kim. I've seen it with me here, and nobody knew who I was here. It was a very hard thing to sue Frank magazine and, of course, win for an absolute lie. So my issue is, like with George Gershwin, we don't think about what he must have felt like when Porgy and Bess was absolutely destroyed. Does anybody even care what Chopin felt like when he was told that he had no idea how to harmonize a tune? That his tunes were sick for sick people? Rellstab, German critic. Imagine, if you want to fix broken hands, then study Chopin. If you have healthy hands, stay away because you'll need a surgeon. Chopin is for sick people in asylums. That kind of stuff hurts. And so I've really thought about that. That's the theme that runs through Gershwin. It's another theme that runs through Chopin, but it's also a theme that I talk about with Kim a whole lot. That's my idea. Now, how do you combat such a thing? Everybody is free to speak, and everybody should be free to speak. My idea is, for IdeaCity, is the notion of responsibility. What I think has happened in journalism, and I see it a whole lot, because I'm now doing this play where everybody can poke fingers and do and what and say, that people will say things, they're uneducated, they're not based on much. Not the people are uneducated, the information is uneducated. They're based on somebody's feelings. It's all fine. It's all fine to be an artist and have someone stand up and say, you know what, you're not so good, but that's what I think. And what has happened, I find, in the world, certainly of arts journalism, and I can't vouch for any other world, is that people are now saying, some journalists are saying, it is this way, it is that way, it is the other way. It isn't. That is only what one individual thinks. And the rest of us who are thinking people sometimes may think differently. Everybody is entitled to say, you know what, Hershey, I don't think you can play. But the fact of the matter is, somebody else may think that I can. But to say, you cannot play, you are not a pianist, whatever, I mean, that hasn't happened, but that kind of stuff happened to Kim here. And I will tell you, it made me very sad to see a lot of it, because I live with this person, and of course, it's not the case. People would come up to, I remember one story. They were making this movie about her, this CBC picture. And the producer had gone to somebody at CBC. I don't know if CBC did it in the end, but so some fellow at the CBC and said, proposed this movie about Kim and her life, and said, we'd like to do this thing, and of course we'd like to analyze her life and so on and so forth. And the response that I was told from this producer was, good, I've been waiting for my opportunity to skewer that bitch. And I thought, wow, what does a person do to earn that? So the producer asked this fellow, said, do you know Kim? Have you ever met her? Well, no. Have you ever been in her presence? No. Did you vote for it? Were you invited? Did she disappoint you? No. So why such a terrible negative attitude? Well, I heard that she's a bitch. And that's a painful situation. So that's my idea, is to be careful. For me, that's the way I live, to be careful about what comes out of my mouth, out of my pen. Because, on the other end, kind of affects people. And those of us have to live with it. Somebody else is in a bad mood, we have to live with it. But, moving on from that idea, there is something else that did happen this year, of course, September 11th. And my little connection to that was that in Los Angeles, after this had happened, I had been there. Kim was on this coast at Harvard. She had just left the day before. It was September 10th, and I was heading back another 5 days after some business. And September 11th happened. I couldn't leave. She tried to get back. And we were there, and I had just finished on Broadway just a few weeks before. And we were all thinking, what are we going to do? We're here in LA. They're having big events in New York. So I and one other fellow, we put together the entire Broadway community. It started out as 3-4. At the end, it was 50 different performers. And we did a fundraiser for the American Red Cross, a benefit. There was no ticket charge, nothing. Show up in a 2,000-seat theater, come, we're going to sing for you, we're going to ask you to sing along, we're going to ask you to have a good time with us, and if you want, you'll support this endeavor, we'll send all the money. We raised a whole lot of money, but I was asked that night to play the theme from Rhapsody in Blue, the slow theme. Ya-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. You talk about connective tissue and about years and about what effect a person has on another person's life. Well, as I sat down to play this theme, it suddenly dawned on me that George Gershwin had written that tune in 1924. It was now 2001. And all I could hear and see as I saw this plane take off and eventually, over and over again, see it fly into a building, was the United Airlines theme commercial. Ya-da-da-da. And that really struck a chord about the continuum. And could George Gershwin have even possibly known where his theme would land up in history? Hmm?